Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new, welcome. My name is Adelina and I make videos about living in this tiny house on wheels and living a more intentional life. Today I want to talk about some common tiny house beliefs. This will be part one because there's lots. And I'm going to give you my opinion on those beliefs, whether I think they're accurate or not. And just basically what I think about those things. So if that is of interest to you, stay watching. There are a lot of interesting beliefs about tiny houses, living in tiny houses, just everything around tiny houses. And a lot of them I have heard, I've had people say to me, people assume, questions that people have asked. And concerns that have been raised. And so I think this is a good topic to discuss. And I've just made some notes about some of the beliefs around tiny houses that I think should be addressed. And these are just my opinions, my experience. Yours might be very different. And that is okay. Oh, by the way, if you hear some noise, it's raining. So that's what you're hearing. And that explains the big har today, because yes, very humid. Anyways, let's get to belief number one, which is a big one actually, and that is that tiny houses are cheap to build. And I think this belief comes from a lot of the YouTube videos that you see online that will have headlines or titles something like, you know, student builds tiny house for $15,000, or she built her dream tiny house for $25,000, or something along those lines. Now, here's the thing. A tiny house can be as cheap or as expensive as you make it, obviously. But a lot of those videos that you see that are really super inexpensive are self-built tiny houses. They are often built with reclaimed materials, and they are they're small. My reaction, my comment on this belief is that it depends. They can be, but in general, if you're going to have a tiny house built by a professional, and if it's a tiny house that you're going to live in full time and therefore want a fair size tiny house because it's got to accommodate you and all your stuff full time, they're going to be more expensive than you think. Especially nowadays when the price of lumber and materials has gone way up for so many reasons, particularly since the pandemic. Everything's more expensive. You know, it's not so simple. Sophie, why do you bite me? Why did they do that? Okay, I'm not going to pitch you anymore if you're going to bite me. Nope, sorry. You had your chance. That's all. Anyways, so are tiny houses cheap to build? They can be, but in general, I think most people are surprised at the cost of building a tiny house, particularly if they have a trailer. You know, they get a trailer that's built for a tiny house, and they are hiring somebody to build it for them, or if they're going a decent size. And if you're going to go with a professional builder who has some certifications, so it's being built to code, there's an added expense there because the inspection process adds to the cost. And then you have sales taxes on top of that, depending on where you're building. If you're building a house that's being built to, say, CSA standards, CSA certified standards, you're not allowed to use reclaimed materials as far as windows and doors and such. And you won't be getting away with using a trailer that you took off of an RV. And so there's lots to think about when it comes to the price of a tiny house. And I think that people are surprised at how expensive they are. But keep in mind that the expensive parts of your foundation built house are your kitchens and your bathrooms. And you still have a kitchen and a bathroom in a tiny house. Yes, just one bathroom, but you still have that, and that you're still putting in windows, and if you're building to code, they have to be new windows. So my thoughts on that belief that tiny houses are cheap to build is that the romanticized version of a tiny house is, this self-built with reclaimed materials, inexpensive tiny house. And again, you can definitely do that, but I think nowadays with the cost of everything, and if you decide that you're going to go with a professional builder and it's being built to a code where it's going to be inspected, and therefore it informs the materials that are being used. For people who want this lifestyle, they want to leave a smaller footprint, they want to live more intentionally, they want to be able to move their tiny house, it's all worth it. This leads me to the second tiny house belief. And I have heard this many times because I sold my townhouse in Calgary to build the tiny house. And so I've had a lot of people tell me that tiny houses are not good investments. They will not appreciate in value, and therefore you're, well, as has been told to me, basically throwing your money away on something that's depreciating. What do I think about that? Well, I think you can tell from my tone that I don't necessarily agree. Now, here's the thing. Your foundation-built house is not appreciating in value. I know that that is a controversial thing to say, but hear me out. What's appreciating in value is the land that your house is on. Very few actual buildings, houses, will appreciate in value. Now, people renovate them and fix them up and update them, which keeps their value, maybe increases their value somewhat. But in general, when you own a property, when you own your house on a property, it's the land that is appreciating in value, not the house. So I do not think that that is comparable. Do I think the tiny house itself is going to appreciate in value? No, I actually don't. I'll be absolutely honest with you. I don't think my house is going to, if I were to sell it today, it's going to sell for more than I bought it. Given though the price of materials now, to build this house today would be substantially more than it was, 3.5 years ago. So maybe it would be about even. But I didn't build the tiny house as an investment. I built it as a home. So that's why it's built exactly to my tastes. I'm really not at all concerned about what potential buyers would think. And another point is that a lot of people who build houses or buy houses and renovate them on property, they're constantly in the back of their minds letting resale value influence their decision. For me, that's an odd way to approach things. I want to enjoy my house myself. So I built my house for me, not for anybody else. Now, I really appreciate that, the thousands and thousands of you, but I get comments daily that they love the design of the tiny house. I hear the comment that it's their favorite layout they've ever seen. I hear that a lot, which just makes me feel so good. And I think that's amazing, and I love that. But I would have still built this tiny house exactly the way it was, even if I knew that everybody but me would hate it. So do tiny houses appreciate in value? I don't think they do. I think they probably hold their value pretty well, especially if they're well designed and well built. But it's never the house that increases in value when real estate appreciates. It's the land. So if I were to buy a piece of land and put the tiny house on the land, everything would appreciate in value because the land is what grows, not the house, and a tiny house is no different than that. Another belief that a lot of people have about living in tiny houses is that you're going to save a ton of money living in a tiny house. Yes and no. Again, it depends. Oh, saucy kitty today. Whether or not you save money living in a tiny house really depends on where you're coming from. if you came from a location and a situation where you had a lot of bills. I had a mortgage, I had a condo fees, property taxes. That has been reduced, obviously. But I do pay to park here, so I still have that. And if I had bought my own piece of property, I would probably have a loan to have bought my own piece of property. I still have utilities. Now my utilities are a fraction of what they were before. But interestingly, when I lived in Calgary, my utility bills were higher than I expected because there was so much of the portion of those bills were the delivery charges for each of those companies just to get the services to my unit. And so while my usage had gone way down, there was still the largest part of each bill was still the delivery and taxes, and I couldn't get rid of that. So you still have that. If you are off-grid, if you are parking on family's property where you don't have to pay rent, or you own your property, have a well, and you've got solar panels and all of those things, then yes, your expenses are going to go way down. But they don't disappear. And I think that it is it's risky to go into this thinking that you're going to be able to, save so much money, because it really depends on the situation you had before and the situation that you set up after. So really, when you're going into living in a tiny house, you have to decide what your priorities are, and then do everything you can to make that happen. So if your priority is to live really inexpensively, really cheaply, then you have to find that situation where you're not paying a high rent to park your tiny house, or you can park for free, you can generate your own electricity, rainwater catchment, or maybe there's a well, septic, that sort of thing that's reduces your utility costs. And then it can be. I will say, in my situation, things are quite a bit less expensive, especially here, than they were when I was in Calgary, and certainly when I had my townhouse. The belief that it's always cheaper to live in a tiny house, that it will always reduce your expenses to this extremely low level, is not, I don't think, is not accurate, I think. Is that how I'm going to say that? I don't think that's accurate. That's how I want to say that. I think it can be, but I think it really depends on the situation, and it really depends on what your lifestyle was before and how expensive that was, and what your priority is and how you set things up afterwards. Okay, I guess I am going to pet you. Another common belief about tiny houses is that only single people live in tiny houses. You do see some videos with couples, but often they're single people that live in tiny houses, either young people or retired people, older people. And so there's this belief that you can't be a couple in a tiny house. You certainly can't have a family in a tiny house. I've even had people comment that I can't have a big dog in a tiny house, that sort of thing. Now, I think that is kind of a ridiculous thing to say, because in other countries other than North America, in other continents other than North America, even other parts of North America, like Canada and the US, we have this love affair with huge houses where everybody has their own bedroom. There are multiple bathrooms, and there are family rooms and basements. Boy, you're in a mood. She is really kind of in a sassy mood today. Anyways, but that isn't the case in a lot of countries in the world. If you travel to Europe, you see how small houses are, apartments are in those countries. And so we kind of have this inflated idea, and I use that word intentionally, about how much space each person needs. But I think that is really subjective. So for some people, absolutely, they would not be comfortable living in a tiny house, even one of this size, because my house is a fair size at 37 feet long and 9.5 feet wide, outside measurements. If I wanted to, my partner and I could easily live here together. I don't think it would be that hard. Now, I do work from home, and if we both work from home, that might be a problem. But for most people who don't work from home, or where both partners aren't working from home, you could easily live in a tiny house. There's plenty of room here for two people. I mean, most people's bedrooms, people are just sleeping in. And then the kitchen is huge. I have a living room. There's enough room for two people to get comfy. There's a chair there, there's a couch here. I just don't understand the mentality of people that adamantly not argue. They have very strong opinions about the fact that you can't that couples can't live in a tiny house. I have space in this tiny house I don't use. The loft, for instance. So let's say my partner was a big gamer, or I was a big gamer. Person could easily set up a gaming area up in the loft, a reading area up in the loft, even a working area up in the loft. And nowadays with headphones, there's no reason why two people couldn't easily be doing their own thing in the tiny house. And I have seen families in a tiny house. Now, I do think that teenagers, and I've mentioned this in other videos, I do think that family with teenagers might struggle in a tiny house, because it is important that teenagers have their own space once they get to a certain age, or at least the ability to go into their cave. So you would have to figure that out. Again, the loft could be used for that. Right now it's open, but you could put like walls there and a little doorway so that they could close it off and have their own space. It's doable. It's all about priority. The idea that everybody needs a couple hundred square feet to themselves is really a fairly recent movement, idea, belief in Canada and in the US, because for centuries people have been living in much smaller spaces and been very happy. If you like a big house and you like everybody to be able to go to their separate corners, that's awesome. You do you. It is absolutely doable, and people do it all the time. My partner and I could easily live in this tiny house and be very content, I think. So guys, I hope that was useful. These are all common beliefs that people have about tiny houses, about living in tiny houses, about what life will be like once they move into their tiny house. I want people to come into this with an understanding and their eyes wide open of what the realities are when you decide to do something like selling your sticks and bricks and moving into a tiny house on wheels. There's a lot of information out there, and there are two camps. There are people that are very critical about tiny houses and want to scare people and discourage them from doing it. And then there are other people, the other camp is everything is roses and everything is always wonderful and amazing. And the reality is somewhere in between, like everything in life. So when you make a decision to do something like this, I think it's important to get as much education as possible, to learn as much as possible. So my purpose in making this video is to give you my perspective on these common beliefs about tiny houses. Again, this is just my opinion, my experience. And you guys know how much I love living in my tiny house on wheels and what an advocate I am for the tiny house movement. But I just want you to be aware and have a realistic outlook so that when you come into this, you're prepared for the good and the challenges that might come your way. Because life has challenges no matter where you live, whether you live in a house, an apartment, an RV, a van, a tiny house, a yurt, a boat, all of those places have challenges, and they have amazing benefits. And for me, it's definitely worth it. So guys, I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying safe. This little girl has been grumpy all day. I think it's because of the weather. She's been sassy, especially during this video. Like, she's even giving me lip right now. Anyways, remember, in a world where you can be anything, be kind, be brave. I love you, and I'll see you next Sunday.